So today we're going to explore the second tier levels of consciousness. Richard Bernstein pointed it out in a book called Pragmatism, an Introduction. And he has 4 forms of pluralism that he doesn't think are very healthy. One is what he calls fragmented pluralism, in which different groups are pushed apart and no communication takes place between them. So very often green creates its own Facebook groups or its own intentional communities. In Northern California, Sebastopol is a city that's very green, and they very often isolate themselves. They want nothing to do with the people in the orange people in Santa Rosa or people in other groups, and sometimes don't watch the news because it's too negative, there's too much negative energy, and so on and so forth. So green can go into this bubble, in this fragmentation, and basically push themselves away or push other people away from their groups. So that's what Bernstein calls fragmented pluralism. The second he calls flabby pluralism. That's the superficial acceptance of others without any serious attempt to understand them. And again, that's often a little bit related to the fragmented pluralism, where these green pluralistic people, postmodern, they understand, their value systems relatively well, but they're not really openly interested in the views of others. So they say, well, everybody's right from their perspective, and if you make these I statements, this is my truth, and things like that. They're usually accepting that, but there's not much curiosity if there are any differences. So Mickey, who's in another training, he sent me something from Facebook where it's this oneness group, all is one group. I forgot exactly what they're called. And they said our only enemy are people who are divisive, people who try to divide us. Again, that's that performative contradiction. And so the person said, well, all they need is just more love, right? And so that's that flabby pluralism. Oh, this person, we don't understand this person, and we don't really understand their needs and why they're so different, but all they need is just more love. Right? So this way we don't have to deal with them. The third one is the polemic pluralism. And this one initially respects diversity. So they really want to hear everyone. And as long as people say, this is my truth and this is the other person's truth, and so on and so forth. But at some point, you often find in these groups that one person or a few people get up and say, well, the truth is how we see the world. Right? There's a big difference between sharing what everybody's individual truth is and trying to understand that and accepting that, versus then saying, but the truth is this and this and this. And then often you get sort of like hierarchy when some people feel that they have the truth while other people only have their own truth. So that's the polemic pluralism. And finally, the defensive pluralism demands the freedom to act as one desires without being held responsible or accountable to others. And so we often see this, for example, even when it comes to freedom of speech or certain acts, right, where people say, well, I have the right to say whatever I want, and if I tell the untruth and if I insult other people, that's okay, because I have the right to act however I like. And in some green trainings or courses or paradigms, people often promote sort of like childish behavior. They say, well, children are really enlightened and they're uninhibited and they're not so programmed and they're totally free. So let's go back into our old childish behavior. And very often, like I had once or twice that people really messed up a workshop room, and I had to pay some carpet cleaning fee and stuff like that because they just felt the rules not to bring in food don't apply to them, and they can just act in childish ways that were not respectful and ultimately took away the freedom or the rights of others. So there's this saying, if you give people total freedom, the first thing they do is take your freedom away. And that's that difficulty that John Stuart Mills and other philosophers realize, that freedom only goes to the point where we take the freedom of other people away. And so that points to this defensive pluralism. And none of these are really open to alternatives. That's the point. And confine one's interest to a specific group out of belief that there is nothing of value to be learned from others. And then we get this engaged fallibilistic pluralism, which brings us into the integral level. That's why I wanted to point this out. So on this, if you will, postmodern pluralism, people seek to understand each other, and in that process of so doing, they criticize their own views and also are critical of those views of people they encounter, and usually enter in some form of dialectic, or at least making what's called validity claims to find out whose truths are maybe a little bit more evolved or have a bigger foundation or better foundation than other people's. And this requires openness and fairness and a willingness to change our minds and imagination and creativity. And I added for the new possible, which leads to integral. And so this brings us out of the green pluralistic stage into the integral stage, which we call second tier, because it's the first level that really sees from a meta perspective or meta cognitive perspective all these previous levels, and that there are natural hierarchy, and that people evolve through these stages. People usually act or make validity claims or have worldviews and values from one of these levels and see why they conflict with each other, and also have a capacity to support people in the growth from one stage to the next, and also to become healthier at each individual level. And as we will see in a moment, yellow is unlike these stages, where each stage of these first tier stages, the people or groups or sometimes even countries try to pull everyone to their level, either up to their level or down to their level. So let's say blue amber, they try to pull everyone at these earlier levels direct into the blue level, and they try to pull everybody who's at a later level down to their level. And the same with orange, right? They try to make everyone orange, no matter which level that they are, but they also try to pull down green back to the orange level. And second tier is the first stage that stops doing that and sees the fallacy in that. And books, we have Integral Life Practice, and Ken Wilber's books, just as an example, Brief History of Time. Ken has now, I think, 23 books out, the latest being The Future of Religion, I think it's called. And then my book I put there, with all humility, only the first one. And then on Tuesday, if you have time, and join us to watch American Beauty. In that movie, we really see, if we're a little generous, we see all 8 levels of consciousness from archaic to transpersonal represented in the movie by different characters who play out these roles and get into conflict with each other. So on the right, again, an Alex Gray painting where we see the body, right? We see inside the body, the physical body, and we see also the energy body in a way, and the importance of intersubjectivity, connection between human beings, and then the spiritual images radiating out or radiating in. So we see from the center, they radiate from the heart chakra out into the universe, and they're in this ocean there, in this sea. So you can also interpret a lot of things into this image, which to me represents mainly embodiment of the material, if you will, with the ocean, the body, the mind, the heart, the soul, and the spirit in connection, in intersubjective and interobjective connection with another human being. The same in this picture here, where we see basically a human face stylized in nature. So this deep not in a green sense, just taking care of nature, but having this deep realization, this reconnection that we are a product and a part of nature while being differentiated from it as well, of course. And where we're going to take our training in the next 21 weeks is to arrive at this image down here of a, if you will, transcendental integral love relationship with intimacy and passion and commitment at the level of all 7 chakras. So the relationship moves away from just relating with each other like you and me, but what is co-created between a couple, and what is then really loved is this which is co-created between partners who have a shared purpose. So here, when we look at stage 7 integral, we first realize that, again, the interior controls or dominates the exterior. Some people call it individualistic. I don't like that so much because integral people can be quite communal and embracing and things like that, but the focus is definitely on being in control and sometimes in unhealthy ways dominating the environment. And the thinking there is systemic, thinking in complexity, thinking in systems. And it's the first stage that recognizes the importance of all preceding levels, including the process of development itself. And I call that to be consciously competent. So integral really makes an effort to understand these stages and to analyze them and to find out at what stage different people are, et cetera, et cetera. And unlike green, it's totally curious and open to, as we just saw with this fallibilistic pluralism, to really understand the perspective of others, even the people that are not integral, right? Because green is usually only interested in green perspectives, orange only in orange perspectives, mythic is only interested in mythic perspectives. So that's the big, big difference. And of course, that makes all the difference in love relationships, where we're no longer judgmental towards our partner and expect him or her to be like us, but there is a deeper acceptance and allowing for them to be at whatever level that they are. And so as a consequence, it does not force its own values onto others, while it still acts in self-interest, but without doing harm to others. And the big mantra there is that knowledge, competency, and functionality supersedes rank, power, gender, or status. So I think we see that a little bit in Joe Biden right now, putting together his cabinet, that we see people of multiple races and skin colors, and we have a good number of females and males, and we have one gay person for the first time as a cabinet member. So more, putting together a cabinet just on competence and on knowledge, but also on functionality and going beyond rank, power, gender, and status. And so that leads to flexibility, spontaneity, and functionality, which becomes the highest priority. So it's a kind of a little pragmatic and, as I will say in a moment, utilitarian. And then here is something important. It re-establishes, I should say, truths and norms through intersubjectivity and interobjectivity. So if you go back a little bit and look at the mythic stage, there, what is truth and what is beautiful and what is right is basically given from an outside authority, and often through scripture or old customs and things like that. And humans who are in this stage usually just unquestionably adopt whatever they are told, what's the right thing to do and what's the true and what's the aesthetically beautiful, while orange becomes objective. It uses the mind and rationality to understand the outside world. So it's just everything that's objective, what can be analyzed, what can be empirically studied and proven, and also in morals, right? They try to use reason and rationality to establish moral norms, like philosophers like Kant was a big moral philosopher, and Habermas in our time, etc., etc. And then when we come to the green level, it becomes subjective, right? We see the swing from being objective over to subjective, and there is no more absolute truths and no more absolute norms, and everything is relative. And instead of saying the truth, we say my truth. And then when we get to integral, we see for the first time in a very deep philosophical and also practical sense, intersubjectivity and interobjectivity, so that we look at what is the emotional reactions to many people to the similar situation, or people who study something in depth, right? Do they all come to similar or the same conclusions? And if that's enough experts or enough people who are qualified, then we say, yes, that is interobjective, right? Many people looked at the same outside phenomenon or things like that, performed experiments, they all came to the same conclusion. So we say for now, right, this is true. Where integral is always open, that things evolve and change, right? But for now, we say something is true, and the same with intersubjectivity, that people, we often see that in certain authentic relating circles or the we space movement and things like that, where people find sort of like intersubjectivity, what is the interior state of people, of groups of people. And it also accepts the inevitability of nature's flows and hierarchies. And also one big feature of the integral stage is, unlike the green pluralistic, which elevates the feminine and the female often over the male and masculine, we already saw it does away with gender norms in a way and treats both genders equally, but it also realizes that there is healthy masculine and healthy feminine and unhealthy feminine and unhealthy masculine, and promotes basically the expression of healthy masculine and healthy feminine, synergetically co-creating and interacting, and not elevating masculinity over femininity or the other way around. So that's also a very important emergence, specifically for love relationships, but for in many different areas, and we will explore that in module 10 of our training. Considers what is good, true, beautiful, and functional. So it makes these validity claims, which we will explore in the next 3 modules, to these 4 dimensions of our being. So any situation, basically, specifically if there is conflict or something needs to be developed, integral people always consider these 4 dimensions. Is it based in some truth? Is it morally good? Is it aesthetically pleasing? And is it functional? So if next relationship conflict you have, you can use these 4 perspectives to find the solution. And of course, other things as well. And finds a natural mix of conflicting half-truths. So this saying everybody's right from their perspective still stands, but integral people add, but people are not equally right. So very generally speaking, the higher you are in the development in consciousness and other developmental lines, usually these people hold more truth in their perspectives than people at earlier levels. And it is utilitarian very often, which means providing the greatest good or happiness for the largest number of people, or the greatest depth for the largest span. And I'll say something about the limitations of utilitarianism in a moment. And finally, we made it at the bottom of the list, supports people in their development through better translation at their level, right? So when we see someone who is very established in the mythic level, and this is where they function, we help them to become more healthy. If they're exiting mythic, we can help them to transition up to the orange level, and then the same for orange, and then transitioning up into the green. So sometimes these people are called spiral wizards because they understand the spiral. They can identify where people are, where they struggle, and support them through better integration at their level or transformation to the next higher level. So integral people have a strong tendency, the word is tendency here, to rather win the argument and lose the relationship. So there's often like this integral I see very much like, hello, you people down there, I can see, oh, you're on the green level and you're on the orange level. And oh, I see what problems you have. Let me tell you what you can improve and what's wrong with you down there. Kind of like, you know, speaking. And then when they go like, who the fuck are you? Why do you think you're more evolved? You know, why don't you come here? And I was like, no, I don't want to deal with you down there. I just want to give you some advice. And then if these people push back, then integral very often wants to be right. And so I realized this paradox, right? You in a way, you want to help these people, but if you piss them off by first having to establish that you're smarter than them, then of course they no longer want to help you. And in relationships, of course, they no longer want to be in a relationship with you, right? So maybe you're the nice guy or the nice woman that they initially kind of look up a little bit. But if you are too much on your pedestal up there and always win the argument and are not really connecting, that doesn't go over so well. So that's one big thing I learned from me. So integral people can be or can be seen as, so both is true, as cynical, cold, calculating, distant, pompous, arrogant, opportunistic, manipulative, and overly analytical. These are a few labels that are given to integral people and sometimes maybe rightly so. And so we can feel quickly discouraged and bored as we think we have seen and had it all, right? So often integral people at some point, they kind of like, well, I've already been green and I did the orange thing, I did the mythic thing, and there's nowhere else to go, right? Because if you're constantly looking down, you know, you find yourself trapped eventually because you don't see possibilities. You're kind of like integral people, I feel, often get very stuck and very, yeah, what is that, anchored or trapped in this integral stage. And then they isolate themselves. And then what integral people often do is they write another book. So that's what I did after my girlfriend left in 2013, and I wrote, out of my frustration, I wrote another book that's twice as thick as the first one. And so there are some integral writers, they wrote like 22 books. And even in Grace and Grit, right? Treya says, oh, I work to get healthy, and Ken wrote another book. So Ken was writing another book and another book and another book. So if you feel called right now to write your integral book, you're probably kind of stuck in this integral level and working on your unique map of the world in form of a book. And more power to you. This is a wonderful time, but it's also nice when you move on and you're done with making the map and you go back to enjoy your life. So that's the isolation phase. As Ken says, congratulations, you're integral, and I'm sorry you're alone. That's a verbatim quote for Ken Wilber. And often has an ascending spirituality and not a very embodied spirituality. And here comes something that for some of you may be very important, is attracted or attracts complex people or partners. We love complexity, right? Integral people, the more complex, the greater it is, right? We can sink our mind into it and take it apart and look at different perspectives. So we love people who are very complicated, very interesting, very challenging, very multifaceted, very radiant, very flamboyant, very sexy, very, you know, this whole thing like an avalanche comes to us and we go like, whoa, this is great, right? And we often overlook that these people have personality disorder. So they're often borderline histrionic, narcissistic, but very seductive and very interesting. And they tell us that they never met anyone like us. Like, you're the first person. I've been with 40 partners that were all horrible. You're the first person who really understands me, right? And we feel like, wow, yeah, all the map making, all this hard work is paying off now. And I'm with this amazing, wonderful goddess or god or whatever the woman called their partner. And then slowly it becomes a one-way street, very much increasingly the therapist and the coach and the financer and whatever, putting up with all kinds of things. And if we don't see that, these relationships end very badly. And so I did them all. I started out with a manic depressive person, which is not really a personality disorder. Then I did borderline unknowingly. Then I did a narcissist, and then a histrionic. And then I had it, right? I said, okay, I need to get off my addiction of women that are so super seductive and interesting. But ultimately, at least I'm not big enough to sustain a relationship with them. So I'm giving up in defeat, and I'm still trying to help them, but I no longer get sexually involved. And I know for a very fact that I'm not the only one. I know several famous integral people who fell and maybe keep falling for these kind of relationships. So, but here I have a few pointers that I think probably describe people at this level quite well, and hopefully you find a lot of this description in you. First of all, it's holarchic. It's no longer systemic. And it's not only holarchic on what we call the level of individual holons, basically from subatomic particles to humans and everything in between, but also holarchic when it comes to social holons, which Ken Wilber is very critical against. And that's one of my pet peeves with Ken, that he's not making more of a point of the importance of healthy love relationships that co-create healthy families with children, nuclear families, and then stable communities and societies, but kind of jumping from the individual to the society. Right? It's like a lot of individuals creating societies, and everything that's in between is such a mess. We just don't want to really address it. And we don't want to talk about social engineering and the importance of healthy relationships, because integral is very focused on the left quadrants and often ignores more or less the right-hand quadrants. And so in this stage, it's about embodiment, and the interior again surrenders to the exterior and seeks peace. And the exterior now in this case is, as I will say in a moment, is like the collective conscious and unconscious, and partly the post-verbal. So I'm going to get there in a moment. So turquoise is really interested in full and healthy embodiment and embrace, and not only knowledge of the previous stages. So it becomes consciously incompetent. It's a little bit like riding a bike. At one point, you no longer have to think about quadrants or levels. You kind of like just naturally operate from these 4 dimensions of our being, and at whatever level you feel is the appropriate resource for you to be a mature, healthy human being and co-create healthy relationships. That's just who you are. You no longer have to analyze it. In other words, you go back into the territory now that you have memorized the map, metaphorically speaking, right? Green just stumbles around in the territory with no map. So they get lost all the time and fuck up. And integral is too much married to the map and studying the map and building the map and analyzing the map and redefining the map and arguing about the map, yada, yada, yada. And so turquoise, I think, metaphorically speaking now says, I no longer need a map. I rather enjoy the meal. I enjoy the territory. I enjoy my relationships. But if I get lost, I still have the map available, right? So, or a musician who can improvise and freewheel a lot, but he can also play from sheet music if necessary. So you can find all kinds of metaphors where you integrate, the theory and the practice, or the map and the territory. So that really happens here on this stage, and it becomes unconsciously competent. And it sees to rather lose the argument and maintain the relationship. And this is such a fallacy, right? This need to be right. And here we no longer have this need to be right, but also without saying, oh yeah, you're also right, right? It's not like accepting in a green way any kind of BS. We're still discerning, but we don't have to rub it into people's face, and we can really honor them where they are and meet them there. And so there is a sense of deep ecology, as I showed the picture. And instead of just being curious about others, which often then comes across as judgmental, this stage is really compassionate and humble. Right? There is a new sense of humility of saying, yeah, even though I have this wonderful map, there are so many details that I don't know. And I also want to stay open to possibilities outside the map. I mean, how can you have a theory of everything, right? Who defines what is everything? There is always something outside the everything, right? As they say in the movie, I Love Huckabees, with the blankets, right? It's one big blanket, and the guy says, well, what's next to the blanket? He says, another blanket. And then what's next to that blanket? Well, it's all blankets, right? It's turtles all the way down, kind of like saying. So there is this humility and compassion, and there is a deep desire for blending, harmonizing, and inviting, this big, no longer seeking or wanting or desiring, but just staying open to life's invitations is a big deal, and a strong collective. So what we're building here, in a sense, and what some people already contacted me, is how can we make this into a stronger collective, this whole group of people who are exploring integral relationships. We still call it integral relationships, transpersonal relationships, right? This collective is a new thing coming out of our integral bubbles and connecting with other people. Focused on the good of all living things, so it's no longer utilitarian, because with utilitarianism, right, the Nazis, for example, since I grew up in post-war Germany, they kind of had the idea to provide the greatest good for the largest number of German Aryan people, and marginalized many other people by this utilitarian thinking, in a way, to say that's just the greatest good for the largest number of people, and we cannot include everyone. And maybe that's a very simple interpretation of utilitarianism, but at the turquoise level, we're basically no longer marginalizing anyone. So that's why turquoise often looks a little bit like green, but unlike green, we're not saying everybody is equally right, right? We still tell people, here are your boundaries. You cannot just take over the club if you're egocentric or magic. You can, in your realm, be the way you are, but you cannot destroy our community or hijack our values or destroy them. And so there is a potential, and I only put that in as a potential, as an authentic traditional tantric and possibly transpersonal non-dual spirituality. But again, we need to be careful not to conflate spirituality with consciousness development. And self is part of the collective conscious and unconscious self. So Thomas Hübl does a lot of good work with the collective unconscious, for example, not only with the individual unconscious, but also with the collective unconscious. And we realize that we as a human being, right, we're actually more or less a product of this conscious and unconscious self. And it's no longer hyper individualistic. And global networking is seen as routine. Again, we see that right here on the screen, and acts for minimalist living, so less is more. So on this level, since it's transpersonal, right, we no longer define ourselves through how much stuff we have or how much money we make and things like that, but more like, do we live a eudaimonic lifestyle, which means, do we find happiness through meaning by doing good in the world in the widest sense. And so this minimalist living is usually very supportive of investing our resources in something else than material things, and does not enter into sexual relationships with partners in first-tier consciousness. I already pointed out why that becomes problematic. Also, if you're single, to really stay open to find an equal co-creator at your level. And lastly, but not leastly, we could even start with that, it becomes linguistically construct aware. And what that means is this insight that emerged definitely with Wittgenstein, maybe with Charles Sanders Peirce and others, and also Jürgen Habermas is a big kind of proponent of this, what's called in philosophy, the linguistic turn, to understand that the world, as we describe it through words, is really not the real world. The limits of our language define the limits of our world. And once we realize that, we get into something that's very hard to grasp for the linguistic mind, that there is this amazing reality out there that's post-linguistic, if you want, or that cannot put into words, right? Sometimes say, I cannot put it into words. And we move towards this more direct or immediate experience and connect actually with what Bhaskar calls the actual, right? So there's the real world, and our direct perception of the world is the actual. And then we go into our mind, or our mind starts to label things and needs to make abstractions of everything, or put everything into symbols and say, oh, can you explain that to me? I don't understand this, or what is this called, or things like that. And so at this turquoise stage and higher stages, we move into this realm of possibilities beyond language. And of course, some people may say, I don't understand this. Can you explain that to me? And that's sort of like, the barrier you want to try to break through. Of the mind can no longer really understand it, but you can sense it and experience it, and advance into this novelty where things don't even have words yet. That's why Bhaskar uses all these neologisms, is the technical word if you make up new words for things, because you describe new realities that humans have not labeled yet with a word, and so you have to make up your own new words. And some people find it very annoying when they read a book and every 10th word is a book that's not even in your dictionary, because the writer made it up to describe something that nobody else has envisioned or experienced so far. And it becomes philosophically pragmatic and critically realistic.